in that. So let's kind of get to some of those Q1 cost updates that we're starting to see. And so the first one is construction grade lumber, and the framing lumber prices are kind of back to their lowest point since like pre-pandemic, which is good. We did see last year with the Canadian wildfires, when they intensified in the summer, that the cost of lumber climbed again in response to those restrictions in the supply chain. And so there's certainly the threat that some of that could happen in the U.S. domestic market as well. And so we're keeping our eyes on that. But for now, it looks like lumber is starting to de-escalate as far as one of those upward trends. And so we've kind of seen some relief in the last year, and we saw a little bit of an uptick as we went into Q1 of 2024, but it was really kind of nominal, and just a slight correction from the declining trend that we had seen overall. Peter, when it comes to construction grade lumber, is anything in here surprising to you?
No, not surprising at all. I think everyone knows lumber is really known for its volatility, and when it's up, it's all over the news. You'll see pictures of a pickup truck full of lumber, and there'll be jokes about the amount of value on that pickup truck. Not as much fanfare when it's down, but we definitely do see fluctuations on lumber in both directions, and there is often a bit of seasonal variation in it. So spring, summer can often see a peak as construction activity is really ramping up into that, and it comes down into the fall. I think as folks are thinking about, starting to get a handle on future projections for lumber, and certainly it's not a one-to-one, but the residential housing market can play a big role in where lumber's headed. So, as we look out and look forward, the health of the housing market is a critical driver of the demand and ultimately, therefore, the pricing of lumber. So, if we start to see softness in the housing market, that might forecast, at least from the demand side, continued falling lumber. The other side of that holds true. If we continue to see strong housing market, permits, starts, things like that, that can certainly start to contribute to a tailwind for lumber costs.
Yep, I certainly agree. So steel, again, this is an area where there's has been, fortunately, some equilibrium that we've maintained into the new year. There's no real signs of immediate, volatility, on the horizon. I think this is another example of a particular, category of construction material that, while we saw a lot of supply chain, issues here that drove up cost kind of during, pandemic, that some of those are starting to sort themselves out, and so we're coming back down to kind of pre-pandemic, level pricing. There has been some inflation there, but it's certainly not as dramatic as we were in the 2 years, prior. So I guess that's good. Peter, comments on that? I mean, because this is something that's not necessarily driven by the residential market nearly as much as lumber.
Yeah, I was going to say, generally speaking, when we think about steel, and you'll see when we talk a little bit about copper later on, really when we think about the global economy, that's a major sort of proxy for where you're going to see steel prices, especially as it relates to expansion in developing countries, right? Because that's when they're building out, and a lot of structural steel, things like that, are a key driver there. The other consideration is a little related, but can be a little bit different, which is, steel production is very energy intensive. So, if we start to see, for whatever reason, increases in the price of energy, you're likely going to see that start to trickle down through into steel prices. And so, again, more of the commentary here is about what are some of the key considerations that you might look at that would start to give you some indication of future price changes. And again, this doesn't work perfectly. If it did, we probably wouldn't be estimating. We would be, commodity trading. But they can start to be some temperature checks that you use when you start to look forward. And we'll talk a little bit about it later on about thinking about risk assessment with project budgets as it relates to some of these factors.
Yep, good point. So concrete and masonry, there's I guess most of the concrete costs are falling, but the kind of the one outlier there is the concrete block, which is just going berserk and doesn't seem to have any real sign of slowing down. And I guess that could certainly go back to, there's a lot of concrete block that's used residentially, in addition to a lot of the stuff that we'll see like in the school systems for summer construction projects. So there's a heavy demand for those. But again, the cost overall tend to be flattening. But it's just that one issue with the concrete block that seems kind of be driving the average. Um, any comment on that,
Yeah,
Peter?
I think one of the ways that concrete masonry is different from, say, steel and copper, as we'll talk about, is it's really dependent on local supply chains. Because of the weight, because of the size of a lot of these materials, you're not shipping them far distances. So while we're seeing these trends on the average across the nation as a whole, there are going to be some location specific situations where they're experiencing different trends, and it would have a lot to do with the local production and the local supply chain related to that. So this is a great illustration of a set of materials where having local supplier networks that you have relationships with can go a long way to understanding what's the unique situation in your market.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of gets back to one of the earlier points, which is kind of looking at the sustainable construction techniques, and you just tagged it there, Peter, which is sourcing those materials from something that's really close to you already. And so you're basically taking a lot of the transportation cost of that out. You're taking a lot of uh, the emissions out of that part of transporting. So it's not only the environmental impact of sourcing something from far away, but also the cost, minimization, of that. So let's look now at, well, you kind of teased it, earlier, which was the conduit and, copper, you know, if you watch the TV show Moonshiners, you would think that copper is still going through the roof, but there's actually been, a reduction in some of that volatility, where we don't see, quite as much crime on the construction scene, people harvesting, copper wherever they can and reusing it. So there's likely to be, a surplus, but we're also seeing some reductions in production from a number of the source locations. So it looks like the supply chain issues are okay for now, but we could certainly see the impact of those surplus supplies as they start to minimize, in kind of reversing that cost trend.
Yeah, I mean, from the supply side, there's certainly a little bit of cause for concern here. I think on the demand side, the joke is that they will refer to it as Dr. Copper, because of its ability to tell you the health of the global economy. The price is going up, there's high demand, usually in an economic expansion. So very similar to steel, this is going to be an indicator, or certainly it's going to move with the global economy. I think the other piece is zooming out to a longer term window with copper, and I'll touch on this multiple times today, and I'm sure as most of you on the call know, there's a structural upward pressure on the demand side for copper, and really that's coming from the push for electrification, and the demand for electricity overall. And I think some of that is, computing is a big thing. We already will mention AI plenty of times, I'm sure, as every good webinar will these days. But as we have greater demand for data centers, computing, charging stations, things like that, you're going to continue to see push on the demand side for copper, and that's going to have to resolve almost certainly with higher copper prices over time.
Yeah, I think we saw, kind of as the prices were really escalating on the copper side, we kind of saw some value engineering taking place where, are there other things that I can use as conduit that's not based on, copper, a less expensive, metal where possible. And so I think we've kind of seen the impact of that kind of rippling out. and again, a lot of that's in the residential construction space, which is, are there things that I can turn to in certain situations that other than copper or other than some of these more costly, materials? But I think we see that kind of across the board, the broader scope of value engineering and choosing what's the best material for the end result that I'm looking for, right now. Um, Insulation. Now, this is one, truthfully, that I I never really followed, much, but I guess it's a critical component in pretty much any, building. It's not only, exterior, insulation, keeping the cold or the heat, out, but also interior, to kind of keep the flow of air at a minimum throughout the facility. So again, the price of fiberglass continues its steady and upward trend and doesn't seem to be, abating, there, which I guess is really good for, people like Owens Corning or something, who are putting out a lot of this stuff. But it it looks like, drywall costs are coming back to something that's closer to normal. Um, Peter, you spend more time kind of looking at the dynamics of the insulation, space. Is there anything that you can kind of add to this commentary?
Yeah, I think certainly it does trend with residential construction, similar to lumber in some respects. And then I think the other piece is, as a lot of states and even nationally, there's been some incentives to improve the efficiency of housing and even commercial spaces. That's really, there's retrofits and there's work being done to improve insulation and approaches like that. So I think that's really part of what you're seeing. And then it has a lot of the same dynamics that we've already talked about: high energy intensity to produce, sourcing and supply chains also contributing to it. So it has kind of like a triple whammy of factors contributing to it, both on the supply side and the demand side. And I think that's how it's resolving.
Yep, certainly makes sense. So actually, I don't have an updated Q1 of 2024 data point for equipment or for labor, but because of the interest in both of those components from the audience perspective, I certainly wanted to include um, what we had available to us. It's kind of a mixed bag. Depending on the type of equipment that you're renting, some of those are in higher demand, and so the cost for those are a little bit, heavier. Some we're starting to see, decline, and so I don't think this is I don't think this is an opportunity where you can say, well, instead of using the hydraulic crane, I'm going to use an articulated wheel ladder, and just because it's cheaper. That's those types of value engineering things aren't necessarily, available from an equipment rental perspective. But I think we're seeing kind of a mixed bag here, that some of the equipment is kind of coming back down, but it's really just kind of a supply and demand feature, I think, for that one. Similarly, when we look at labor, certain of those skill sets are declining. Others of them are continuing on with the upward trend. I would anticipate that all of these are going to continue to increase, over time, just as they have been, because it's not necessarily a shortage of the people doing this type of labor, but it's an availability, issue, and so it's there's there's plenty of them to do the work. It's just a matter of getting them onto your site to do the work. That really seems to be, driving up these prevailing, wage, uh, prevailing wage. I guess it's easy to just end it up there. So let's let's kind of get into some of the audience, Q&A, because I mentioned early on that there were like 500 different messages that had come in, and a lot of them were looking at kind of what are some of these emerging trends and innovations that we're starting to see influence the construction industry, and as we move through the rest of 2024, and even in, out, 18 months potentially. So um, at a high level, Peter, what are you seeing as the prevailing trends or innovations that are having the greatest impact on the foreseeable future for 2024?
Yeah, sure. And it's a great question to start with. I love like the big picture questions as a starting point. And I also had the benefit of reading the 500 questions that we got. And so I'm going to tailor my answers to some of those other questions in terms of some of the most asked about trends and innovations. And I am going to kind of separate. I'm going to talk about trends first, and then a few of the kind of high level thinking around technological innovation and its role in the construction life cycle. So just starting with that trends, I really, and I mentioned it earlier, but I'd like to go a little deeper on it now, is this idea of strategic sourcing of materials. And I think, there's a lot of drivers of this, but the two big ones, and they were brought up multiple times, is the Build America, Buy America Act, and then the sustainability requirements in the Inflation Reduction Act, right? So those are having a significant impact on the sourcing of materials and how we think about executing construction projects today. And it has a tremendous impact. So I'd like to spend a bit of time this morning, or this afternoon, excuse me, talking about some of those sustainability requirements and what the ultimate impact of those are. So, I think when we think about what are some of those requirements or how do those impact us as we think about construction and estimating, these sustainability requirements could be at the design level, right? So this is thinking like, is it a LEED building? Is it a net zero building? Are we designing to a certain set of standards? It could be how we're building it, right? So are we using low embodied carbon material? Are we identifying environmentally preferred products that we're using within the construction of it? And I think ultimately, whether or not we all agree or with the intention of the initiative or how they're being implemented, they're likely not going away for a large swath of projects that are going to be completed. And so I think the key is for contractors and design firms and AEs to figure out how they're going to operate in this new paradigm and really understand the implications for them in that. So I want to talk a little bit about what we see as some of the implications of these kind of design standards or construction standards that relate to the sustainability requirement. I think the first one at a high level is really just this increased demand for specialized materials. So I talked about it a bit earlier, and I'll hit it again. Supplier relationships are going to be a key for project success. So, for example, if you have to source low embodied carbon glass or something like that, the number of suppliers you can go to starts to get reduced significantly from what it is if you're able to buy any of it. So it's going to be critically important to kind of almost rebuild your supplier network so that you have the options and you understand the current market environment as you are potentially bidding on projects requiring these standards so that you're prepared for it and you can be successful. When it comes to actually executing the projects, there's probably additional training and skills needed for the folks actually implementing the new sustainable technologies or installing new equipment associated with that sort of low, no carbon construction standard. So we already know we have a skilled trades gap in terms of having enough people to do the work we need. And now we're layering on new technologies and new skills that are needed. So there's definitely going to be sort of an up leveling in terms of the skill set there. The other piece is when it comes to planning and executing the project that I think when you start to layer in these sustainability, you increase the complexity pretty significantly. So whether it's coordinating more complex material sourcing, whether it's implementing new technologies or new construction standards, and then whether it's documenting and adhering to specific construction practices, all of this is likely to require additional time, additional documentation, and additional complexity in the overall project execution that can have implications for delivery time frame as well as cost to deliver that project. So those kind of all sound like challenges, right? And maybe for good reason, but certainly make lives a little bit more difficult. I think on the positive side, for those contractors that look to early specialized or kind of understand how they can operate in this new paradigm, provides a great opportunity to differentiate those firms from others. And we know, the construction marketplace is very competitive, and any way that you can differentiate, particularly for projects that are likely going to have significant funding coming with that ties to those sustainability requirements, really allow them to capitalize. And I think what we're seeing is those that embrace this early on and figure out how to operate in that new paradigm can be successful and really and capitalize on those opportunities. So that's kind of like, one of the major trends, and we hear about that a lot, with the folks that we talk to. In terms of innovation or technology, what I think we're seeing across the construction landscape, from early pre-construction through project delivery and even to operation and maintenance on the back end, is really looking at implementing technology, whether it be software, whether it be AI, Internet of Things, sensing technology, all of these different tools to reduce the time and the steps in between each phase of the construction life cycle. So this could be, and I'm gonna like maybe try and avoid using the buzzwords around AI and stuff, but you can feel free to layer those in as you see fit. But this could be using automation and intelligence to move from design to estimates, right? How do we start to streamline that? Automatic quantity takeoff, identifying different pieces within a design, being able to translate that to an estimate more quickly. As you get into estimate building and proposals, how do you start to create collaboration tools between contractors, subcontractors, designers, suppliers, to create efficiency in who's contributing and who's sourcing material and labor for those projects? It can also include, how do we start to streamline project tracking during the execution phase, and probably more important, risk management leading up to and into the construction phase? How do we start to see some of the potential for change orders or construction delays, or even material sourcing delays? Any of those, how do we start to identify those more readily and earlier in the process? And then I think finally comes down to, how do we automate the transition once projects are complete into the asset management? So as the project's complete, how do I then leave the owner with all the information they need to effectively maintain what was built? And so this is creating automated asset registry and implementing it into CMMS systems or asset management systems to ultimately set that owner up for success. So what you can see is, there are certainly some high-level trends that are causing organizations to rethink how they approach the construction process. And then there's really a whole slew of various technologies that organizations are able to implement to really streamline the full construction life cycle. And I think, leaning into that and identifying those that work for you and looking to stitch those together in a way that allows you to deliver more effectively will go a long way to setting organizations up for success to operate in what will ultimately be a much more complex world in 2024 and beyond.
It's I too kind of cringe, when people use like a bucket term of AI, because AI can be so much stuff. But I look at some of the kind of the more simple things, or definitions of AI, like whether it's machine learning or natural language processing, and something just as simple as being able to recognize optical characters on a nameplate, and just being able to automatically move all of that stuff in as a streamlined workflow, without having to have that additional manual step where maybe you're keying in the serial number wrong. It introduces opportunities for inefficiencies. Anytime you have some of those inefficient processes, and so I think that using, we'll call it technology in general, to streamline or connect those different workflows, as you mentioned, so it facilitates data moving around and being collaboratively shared, amongst the organization. So that's kind of where I'm seeing a lot of the technology implications as well early on. It's just kind of, how do we streamline these workflows and try to minimize some of these additional tasks. And I think that kind of fits into what you pointed out, is that like this prevailing trend, which is what you can call it sustainability, but that's using a local supplier if possible, because that's reducing the fuel cost of getting that material to you. But it's also using somebody that's local, so it fits into that Build America, Buy America edict. And it almost seems like to me, and you may or may not disagree, but it sounds to me like a lot of these providers of, whether it's the materials, whether it's the labor skills, they're almost trying to rebrand themselves as, hey, we're your sustainable partner, right? And however you wanted to define that. So, okay, we're an American company, so therefore we fit into this idea. Or, we have these more sustainably sourced materials. And so if you're looking for, net zero, if you're looking for, a LEED certification, we can play into to that as being your sustainability partner in delivering these types of construction services.
Yeah, I think there's some element to that for sure. I think there are some new technologies that it's figuring out how to implement new technologies alongside that. The other point that your comment made me think about is I think at the foundation of both trying to connect the workflow when I talked about that, and even the sustainment, the bedrock of all of this is the ability to create and capture and organize vast amounts of data. Because even on these sustainable sourcing, it's really about not just being able to say, hey, that's someone down the street, but being able to document the impact of that sustainable sourcing and communicate that impact to the stakeholders, because that's a major requirement of those activities. Similarly, when we think about connecting the workflow between design, estimating, construction, and asset management, that's all based on this bedrock of data. And it's how do I create data around my projects, around my estimates, around my buildings, my assets, and how do I do that with high fidelity in terms of the accuracy of the information, but without bogging me down in endless amounts of data entry. So I think that's where we're seeing the combination of technology with automation, with intelligence, with machine learning to automate that process, to get the right data, and then allowing that data to move through various applications to be used, whether it be in coming up with an estimate, whether it be to ultimately populate my asset list, whatever that might be. So yeah, I think the data becomes an increasingly important component for success there.
And when you kind of blow up sustainability beyond just the materials or the responsibly sourced or minimizing, waste on site, minimizing the amount of stuff that's having to go into a landfill. One of the often kind of overlooked aspects of sustainability is the ESG side, so the environmental, social, and governance. And just looking at what are the different diversity certifications of your supplier pool. So a lot of times you're having to report out to these government agencies that X percent of the subcontractors that you're using to deliver on your products have some sort of diversity certification. And so that's again kind of showing that we're driving forth all of this new change in a very equitable way, and that everybody gets a piece of that opportunity. So it's good insight that I think you netted it out well, that it kind of fits in this big bucket of sustainability and using innovative technology to kind of streamline things, but it's a far more nuanced conversation than just being able to put it into those big buckets.
Yep, no question.
So after I just spent all this time talking about how costs are stabilizing, why is it that we're not really seeing the impact of those cost stabilizations why hadn't it snapped back to 2020?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's an interesting question. I think the concept of stability is the first one that I was sort of chuckling with a colleague of mine. We were talking about price stability and what do we actually mean by price stability. And the reason I say that is because we were actually looking at something over the 60 plus years that RS Means data has been tracking. We have a measure called the HCI, the Historical Cost Index, which is a basket of construction costs that we track each year over time. And in the 60 plus years that we've tracked it, we've never seen prices go down year over year, except once. Believe it or not, that once is this year. So now that's really interesting, because if I look back 2 years, prices are still up 12% or 13%. So I think what we are seeing is over a multi-year period from 2020, we have had extraordinary price increases. But we are starting to see those price increases, at least in the last year, start to slow down. It has to do with the supply chains resolving to a certain extent, commodity prices coming back down a bit in many markets and things like that. But I would say any of us expecting price increases to go on a sustained downward trend to back to the 2020 levels, there's not really historical precedent for that. At the same time, when we start to say, what do we mean by stability? I think can these increases, or will these increases become a bit more predictable and slower in pace? And in many cases, historically, that has been the case. When we have a lot of volatility, it kind of it shakes out as sort of the market adjusts. And I'd hesitate to say this time is different. That's always a dangerous saying, but I do think we find ourselves in a unique time in history where there are a lot of independent factors that contribute to price and cost volatility for construction. So I'd like to walk through those, and I think whoever asked this question, it's probably not going to make you feel much better at the end of it, but it's trying to lay out the challenge of the environment that we have heading forward. So I think the first one is, we are at, it may not always seem that way with some of the challenges it creates, but we're at a really unique time in society with so many technological kind of breakthrough technologies coming out all at once, whether that be electrification and electric vehicles, artificial intelligence and the compute that's associated with it, space travel even. A lot of the technologies that are all emerging as we speak now are great technologies and will do wonderful things for society, but they all require a significant amount of investment in construction to build out the infrastructure needed for these to be successful. And much of that is in what I would say is undersupplied, or the inability to dramatically grow supply of those materials. So copper being kind of the classic example. And so as that demand continues to be persistent year over year and persistently growing, it's going to create upward pressure and it's going to create challenges. And it's not going to be a straight line. There's a whole host of reasons why it could go down, but we understand that, given this technological revolution that we find ourselves in society, which we've had many in the past, it is going to have an impact, and it'll likely put some upward pressure on pricing long term. The second one, again, not a really fun one when we talk about it, but is geopolitical conflict and even some of the trends in some smaller ways towards a kind of deglobalization. What this is really contributing to is kind of persistent logistic and supply chain challenges, and we've really seen them across like most major material categories. And it's a lot of unpredictability. So depending on where those geopolitical conflicts might be and what materials or commodities or supplies are provided in those areas can have a lot of impact into how it trickles down through. But knock on wood, hopefully it's not the case, but if those continue in uncertain ways, there is very likely to continue to be some implications in terms of price volatility for certain materials, depending on how they manifest. Now, the next one isn't a new thing, but given the fragile supply chains that we talked about, layering this one on top can create a lot of challenges, which is natural disasters. So we talk about the Canadian wildfires and the impact to lumber pricing of those. Well, because we have fragile supply chains for lumber already, something like those wildfires can have a dramatic impact on the availability and supply of lumber to the market. So those types of situations, there are many of those out there in the world, unfortunately, and things that we will have to come to grips with. The last two are a little bit more of sort of structural realities that we find ourselves in North America. So the first one is really our structurally challenged skilled labor market post-COVID. So what we look at, and when we look at, we have a massive deficit in terms of the skilled trades available to do the construction work that we need. And so I've been having conversations with contractors, and I've had multiple, maybe not verbatim, but say to the effect, it's the golden age of being a contractor because there is so much work, I don't have enough time to do it all. And I think, for contractors and skilled trades, this is a good thing. But in terms of the cost of that work, the demand is outstripping the supply of people to do it. And so that's driving the cost up. And we're seeing that in the labor costs and in the likelihood of continued increases in those labor costs going forward. So that's going to be a continued challenge, and until there's a resolution to that gap, which would be either a increase in the availability of skilled trades or some technologies that can reduce the need for that, we're going to continue to see that upward pressure. And again, not saying that's a good or a bad thing. It's a reality. And I think the last one is really a push in terms of the reinvestment for aging infrastructure, particularly in the United States and North America. When you consider when a lot of the infrastructure and facilities in the United States were built out, you're talking 50 to 80 or more years ago. Well, that means all of that infrastructure is reaching the end of its useful life, and it's going to require major reinvestment to continue to be operational. I live in Rhode Island, and I drive on a road, a highway just down the street here, and there are 5 bridges 5 overpasses I go over. All of them are being replaced. These are not discretionary investments. They have to do them. These are bridges that if they weren't replacing them, they would have to be closed, and they are major throughways. Additionally, if any of you are in the Northeast region, you know there's a major bridge in downtown Providence that 100,000 cars a day go over, and they had to shut it down because of a structural failure. These are examples of that aging infrastructure, which is going to result in investments needing to be made, not discretionary, not a choice. And there's going to be significant amounts of these, which are going to drive huge investments into construction, which is a great thing, and kind of refreshing our infrastructure. It's also going to put tremendous demand and challenges on supply chains, labor availability, material prices, and all of those. So when we think about the factors at play, and many of these are independent of each other, which is equally challenging because they could all affect us at the same time. But all of these really set the environment up for continued volatility in pricing. And so I think we'll talk a little bit about how you navigate this when you're thinking about a project, but I think the expectation should be price cost volatility will continue in the future. And it's really about how do we get the information we need and build in the practices that we need to operate within that volatility rather than hope it goes away.
Yeah, I think you've done a great job of teeing up the next question, and you kind of alluded to it a little while ago, which was, with all of this volatility as kind of the backdrop, what are kind of, I don't know, best practices, for lack of a better term, for when you are starting to plan out work that's years from now, whether that's major reinvestment in infrastructure, whether that's breaking ground on something that how do you wrap your head around what potentially could be going on with all of the materials, labor, equipment that you're trying to pull into this estimate for future work?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wish I had a great answer for this, but I'll share some themes of the folks that we talk to and how they're handling this, and sort of an aggregation of some of the best practices. But I think the first thing, and this is a little bit of a jokingly, but like, assume there's going to be meaningful volatility in the price of the construction, and then just be pleasantly surprised if it doesn't happen to manifest. Realistically, though, what that means practically is a few things. So, for every meaningfully sized project, and some may argue for almost every project, you should really have a comprehensive risk analysis of that project. So there's a couple of elements in my mind for this. One is, it can be really helpful to identify some key indicators or market indicators that you could look at to understand how the cost of that project might change. So the example I've been using is, if you happen to have a project that has a heavy component of lumber, you probably want to keep an eye on the residential market, and that can start to give you an indication if you start to see certain trends there of risk that may be inherent in the project budget going forward. The second piece of that risk analysis is early on, multiple years out, certainly you don't want to have a single project budget. Instead, do some scenario planning. So have a range of outcomes: worst case scenario, best case scenario, our kind of assumed scenario, or our base case. And these should be updated regularly as you get new information. The key here is by establishing a range of outcomes and communicating it with stakeholders, you can begin the discussion on what mitigation options exist if you were to, say, realize the worst case scenario or start to trend in that direction. So the goal here is making decisions earlier on pivoting, value engineering, change of design, whatever it might be, before too much money and time has been committed to it. Now, the obvious one that initially you probably all roll your eyes at is building contingencies. Obviously, we always want to build contingencies into construction budgets. I think the piece that I would say here, and we're going to talk a little bit about it on the next one, is you can do a careful review of the complexity and the major materials and trades driving the overall project budget. And when you understand where you may have higher volatility materials or trades driving the project budget, you can adjust your contingency in accordance. So we're going to show in a slide, lumber, I keep hitting on lumber, but it's a great example, is highly volatile. You probably need a bit of a bigger contingency for projects that have a heavy contribution of lumber versus other materials that maybe don't fluctuate as much. Another factor would be engaging suppliers and contractors as early as possible. So in theory, you could lock up pricing early on. That can be a good approach. It's not always possible given procurement requirements, things of that nature. But I think it goes beyond that, which is developing those relationships so that you can get insight into potential market changes earlier on and lead times and factors that you would need to you would want to consider in terms of the project risks. So as important as it is to be able to try and lock those prices, it's equally important to understand where the market's going in real time. The other piece is once you establish a project budget, don't just establish it once and leave it forever. Regularly review and update that planned budget. So look for opportunity to get up-to-date data, recent project experience. So if you have a project that is using a lot of concrete and you just did another project and you got bids back for concrete, go back to your project budget and say, hey, right now, this is what the level is coming in at. Let's flow that through the budget. Continually updating as you get closer to the procurement of that project will allow you to really narrow in on the true cost of what it's going to look like. This also will allow you to push those decisions that we talked about earlier around mitigation of maybe overages, push those decisions earlier. And ultimately, if there are questions about project viability given budget, you want to make those decisions as early as possible. So continually updating the budget will really allow you to tackle that in a way that I think allows you to be as efficient with the dollars and the time that you have. So those are just some of the ideas. There's certainly more that different organizations are going to implement, but at a high level, those are some of the tools that individuals have in their toolkit.
Yep. No, that's perfect. Thank you, Peter. And we probably need to kind of fast track into the detail, for this one as we start to run up towards the top of the hour.
Sure.
But it was basically which construction divisions have the most volatile, materials, and we've got some information, on that. It's almost like you knew the question was coming. So why don't you just kind of speak quickly to
I'll hit this one. So like I said, lumber is the most volatile. This is movement per quarter. So this could be up and down. But this is saying lumber is moving on average 12% per quarter. That's a huge amount of variation, which means that if you do an estimate today, in 2 quarters, it could be very different. Steel, rebar, those are all high volatility materials. And so considering that in project budgets can be really important. And you can see there are some that are less volatile. This can be a really good tool, understanding to be used when you're thinking about contingencies.
No, that's perfect. And so let's look at the impact of location. So it's always location, but it actually does seem to kind of manifest itself, here. So kind of talking at a high level of where we're seeing the variance.
Yeah, sure. So, when we look overall nationwide, we saw a modest decrease from Q3 to Q1, Q3 of 2023 to Q4 of 2023 to Q1. We saw about a 1% decrease nationally. That was what I mentioned earlier. You can see, though, there's a lot of variation regionally in terms of some are up +5, some were down -5. And so there's a lot of variation that we can see, and this is going to have a lot to do with the prevailing wage. It's going to have a lot to do with material availability, and it's really going to have a lot to do with the demand. And in this case, demand would be things like major infrastructure investments, mega projects, things of that nature can have an outsized impact in driving up the costs over a short period of time, which 1 quarter is a fairly short period of time.
Yeah, and one of the things that I liked about this next slide is that it kind of shows the relative impact of material changes compared to the relative impact of the labor fees, and so it's just kind of that. And it's almost like, I think you had mentioned this, yesterday when we were talking about it, that, it's like on the material side, you're getting maybe a 10%, swing from one extreme, to the other, but it's a whole lot more significant when you look at the impact of those radical swings for the labor component.
Yeah, you hit it right on the head. Material, it's fungible. You can move it around our country pretty easily in most cases. When it comes to labor, there's a whole lot more factors that come into play in terms of variation that you'll see. So in certain urban centers with various labor environments, they can have much higher labor costs than other parts of the country. And so there's just a lot more variation. And so this would be something, particularly for anyone doing work across multiple geographies. You probably already know these things, but it's something to keep a close eye on as you're developing cost estimates.
Yeah. And so I guess the softball question, can you explain when adjustments are made to the material pricing versus the city cost index?
Yeah, absolutely. So, this is a great question, timely question. So, historically, RS Means has used the CCI factor, where each quarter we research materials around the CCI locations to essentially create a factor that allowed us to move price both in time, so quarter over quarter, and in space, in location, so adjusting for a specific region. And that was really how we kept those estimates up to date. Gordian has spent a lot of time and made a lot of investment in upping our research efforts to be able to capture as many data points around current material pricing each quarter across as many categories, across as many geographies as possible. And within the last year, we have reached a critical mass of data where now each quarter we will be able to provide updated material costs at the base level. So we'll no longer need the CCI to move prices in time. Instead, we will have that updated material costs quarterly. And then we'll still provide the CCI as a means to regionalize your estimates. And so at the end of the day, this for us is a huge advancement in our data. And this is a huge enhancement that I think everyone will find incredibly beneficial going forward. And this is really a testament to our team's efforts around becoming more efficient and collecting and capturing a broad supply of construction costs across the country. And given the challenges with the potential for price volatility going forward, I think this is going to be a critical enhancement that will allow our estimates to track more closely with the current market environment, quarter in and quarter out going forward. So we're really excited to offer this in Q1 and going forward. And I think hopefully that answers everyone's question on that.
Yeah, it certainly answered mine. So we basically have an opportunity, Peter, for you to kind of jump into a couple of things that are kind of new from a product perspective. I don't know if you want to, we've only got about 5 more minutes left of this window. You want to just do it within the slides that we have prepared, or do you want to take control for a minute?
Yeah, I think that's fine. We can just do it in the slides. So, before we finish up, a lot of the questions that we got, and we got, like John said, 500 questions, and a lot of them are questions around the trends that we saw within the cost data within RS Means and various materials and various divisions and various geographies. And, I think we see a tremendous amount of interest in these webinars as we do them quarterly, and our blog posts around cost trends. And so, that's great, and we love doing these, but we get the sense that we can provide more up-to-date or more frequent information to customers around this stuff. So we're launching a product called Cost Trends. It's one of our data insights products, and it's really a flexible dashboard that will allow the user to slice and dice the data by division, by geography, and by labor, material, and equipment and total, to essentially answer almost any of the questions that were asked around trends. Answer it for yourself in one easy to access self-service place. And so as we get into not just the informative, like I'm curious what's going on in Alabama for steel prices, also as you're starting to think about how do I implement some of these techniques around contingencies for projects or understand the geographic differences, it can be a tool that you can use to answer those specific questions for you. So we're really excited for launching this product, and we think it's going to create tremendous value and really kind of be an extension of these webinars that we do around cost trends for you to have on your web browser day in and day out to really become a critical part of your workflow. So we're excited about that, that product being launched. Additionally, a product that is now available is our partnership with eTakeoff to provide a digital takeoff solution alongside our RS Means offering. So obviously, having a takeoff solution that allows you to more effectively get quantities from your drawings and implement them into RS Means to create estimates is going to accelerate the workflow. And we're excited with our strategic partnership here with eTakeoff to really help our users increase the accuracy, the efficiency, and ultimately get to your estimate faster and more accurately going forward. And so eTakeoff's a national leader, and we're really excited about this partnership.
Awesome. So thank you for that, Peter. We've covered a lot of information in a hurry. If anybody wants the details of all of these construction cost, insights from the Q1 report, that's available on Gordian.com. We also have an updated labor report that we did in conjunction with Construct Connect, which is available also on Gordian.com. And there are individual blogs for kind of what the data says for each of these different material types that we discussed, earlier. So those can all be tracked and followed. And again, they're updated every single quarter. So just some additional resources that you, the audience, might choose to avail yourselves, of. So with that, I want to thank Peter for joining us, here today. I feel like, Zach Galifianakis in like Between Two Ferns or something. We've got a little therapy session going on. So Peter, thank you for your involvement. For our attendees, again, we got a whole bunch of questions that are coming through, but we will take those and follow up, and then there will be additional information. The recording will be made available, as will the slide materials, shortly after the webinar. So with that, I want to thank everybody for your time and attention today, and sign off. Y'all have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Great being with you.